Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're talking about healing from DID. So this is DID part 2. Again, it's going to be a fairly short segment, about 30 minutes if I can do it. The last one was a little bit longer than that, as you probably noticed. So again, I'm going to be talking about my experience of DID and today specifically on the healing process. So you're going to learn kind of an inside out perspective of what the healing process was like. I'm going to run through it fairly quickly, so I'm hoping it'll make sense to you. A couple things. One is, again, this is my experience, and I was extraordinarily lucky to have found a really amazing clinician at the time in 1993. I mean, he's still an amazing clinician, and I was able to afford paying for it. Which is a really big deal. A lot of people don't have the funds to pay for the kind of therapy that they might want. And if they do, they can't always find someone that's good in their area. So it's just a point to make so that you're not imposing on people the thought that this is what they need to do. It really should be people identifying for themselves whether they want to go through a healing process and what level of healing they want to do. So for example, I went through a 5-year process of healing and then went back to therapy every few years when something would come up. And so I went off and on then for another 10 years. That's a lot of therapy. And a lot of people don't want to do that, can't afford to do that, and can't find somebody to do that with. But I want you to know what the process is like so that if you're working with someone who is seeing a therapist about it, if they tell you about the therapeutic work that they're doing, that you have a sense of where it fits in, like whether that's right or not for DID. So for example, treating someone with PTSD is going to look different than someone with DID. In fact, treating someone with PTSD could actually make someone with DID worse. So anyway, I want to lay this out for you. And then for the clinicians that are watching this, I want to kind of lay out for you what the process was like so you can think about your own work. Or if you want to work with people with DID, there's a couple places where you can get training and a couple people you can reach out to get supervision. So, all right, so I'm going to share my screen. And here's my PowerPoint. And I'm going to walk you through it. Here we go. Okay, so healing from DID, exploring a lived experience. So as I mentioned in the first segment, I was 31 years old when I found out that I had DID. This was January of 1993. And I was referred to Dr. Richard Sheffitz, who was extraordinary in the 1990s. And in 2015, wrote a book about the healing process, about working with people with DID. And this book is considered by many clinicians as the Bible for working with people with DID. And I'll lay out for you what is it about this book that is, or his approach that's different than other people's approaches. So first, though, I kind of want to ground us in what the research shows of how healing happens for people with DID. It also shows the existence of DID because this phase-oriented treatment has shown to improve people with DID. So it is a different approach than what you would do with someone with PTSD. So people with DID are generally unresponsive and may deteriorate under standard treatments, which is cognitive behavior therapy and exposure therapy for PTSD. That can actually make someone who has DID worse. It can create more crisis for that person, make it harder for them. So And this is the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation that have laid out kind of what is recommended for people with DID in terms of treatment. And it involves these 3 stages or phases of treatment. And it'll make sense that this is be what you would need to do. So the first stage focuses on safety and stabilization. And that makes sense, right? So if you think about my experience, I went to see this movie. I started now having panic attacks, which kind of created a crisis for me. So when I went to go see a therapist about this, the first thing they need to do is to help me deal with that crisis and then stabilize me. And then we can start doing the work of healing from DID. So, but up until this point, I don't know I have DID. So I also have to learn about what DID is and feel safe and stable before doing that trauma processing. And that's the second stage. It's processing the trauma and containment, meaning so that you can function in your life while you're doing this healing process. And then the third stage is called integration and rehabilitation. So it's not that you're trying to get rid of parts, but what you're actually doing is reintegrating those experiences, the abuse that you suffered, that you separated out to not feel. You need to take those in as if those happened to you, so that it feels like that happened to you and not to different people. And then you also have the same narrative, the same history of your parts. So you have a more whole experience of what happened in your childhood. So some people, some clinicians in particular, tell clients or work with clients that they have to integrate, they have to get rid of their parts in order to heal. And that's not true. And that actually isn't appropriate to tell someone that they need to get rid of their parts to heal. The healing process involves getting to know that you have parts, figuring out who they are, what they did, how they did it, and why. What role do they play now? And that kind of communication that happens inside creates a level of collaboration that enables someone to move through the world as if they're one. In some cases, parts do integrate because their only role was to hold those experiences apart from the person. And now that isn't needed anymore. But in a lot of cases, people don't want to get rid of their parts, and the parts don't want to go anywhere. So the process is really, let's discover what's in there. Let's bring it all together so that you all can move through the world together. And then figure out how you move through the world, because now you have more information about your person, about your childhood, about who you are in the world. So now how do you move through the world safely? Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, within this 3-phase approach, Rich did a couple things. First, he used a whole bunch of different modalities in order to achieve the healing of these 3 phases. And I'll lay those out for you. But here's what made Rich's approach different. In Rich's book and in his work with me and other clients, what he did was he built connections. So meaning that in the beginning, in the safety and stability phase, he's building the relationship that he and I have. He's building trust. I'm learning that I have DID. I'm learning to accept it. I'm dealing with what's happening in my life in that moment, not necessarily the past yet. And I'm learning that this is what I do in therapy. At the same time, he's identifying who are the people in my life that are helping me get through my life right now, and then helping me to strengthen those connections with my husband at the time, my coworkers, my boss, my friends. And I'm learning which friends can handle this and which friends can't, what relationships are real and which ones aren't. Because remember, I'm a person that is really segmented and hasn't figured that out and hasn't told anyone. So I'm learning now, who can I trust? So this is a level of intimacy and vulnerability that I have never experienced before. And so first, that's in that first stage, and that will continue throughout. In the next stage, though, he's building connections between me and my parts. And so we're getting to know each other, to trust each other, to communicate, to understand each other. And in that, I build collaboration and cooperation that enables me to move through the world as if I am one. And then when I go through that process, then I learn what happened to me, and I learn which parts are still going to be around. And in that stage, I'm learning, how do I now live a life that incorporates the fact that I have parts and that I was severely sexually abused by my family and other people in our community. So how do I do that? And that's that rehabilitation stage. And at the same time that I'm doing that, Rich is helping me to build connections with the people that are still in my life and the new people in my life, new coworkers, new friends, relationships, all those people. So I'm learning whether I can tell people or not, how I tell them, what I tell them, and then how I learn to trust, how I learn to be vulnerable, how I learn intimacy, all those things. How do I move through the world as if I'm one? So this is the process, and what he added to it were all the connections. And what the connections did is the connections enabled me to leave therapy and to live a life that I could be happy and healthy without the need for constant therapy. And so it's been, so I saw Rich from 1993 to 1998, so 5 years straight. And then our work ended. And then a few years later, I started remembering some new stuff. So I went back to see him, did more of this work together, built more connections around me, and then finished that work, and then was done for a couple of years, and then went back. And this went on and on. So these 2-year kind of tune-ups, as we used to call them, which I think is kind of funny, these 2-year little tune-ups were part of this. All along the way, I'm learning to do this on my own and learning to build community, which is enabling me to continue moving through my world with not having to have a therapist all the time. So not that there's anything wrong with that, but I have the choice to not have a therapist, where if I didn't have those connections, if I didn't build that community, if I didn't know how, then I wouldn't have that choice. And that's what Rich did that was different. Okay, so there are therapeutic modalities that were used, and I'm just going to run through them here, and then we'll go through each one separately. So first, there's psychosocial therapy, so talk therapy. And we're talking about cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and what I call part work or trauma processing, which was not EMDR in my situation. And you have to be really skilled in EMDR to do that kind of work with people with DID. It's totally possible, but you have to be really skilled with that. So for me, it was meeting the parts and talking about what those parts held, what they did, what role they play now, that kind of thing. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The closest thing I could find to that kind of therapeutic work is integrated family systems. And that's different because in integrated family systems, the client is expected to have certain parts, and you meet those parts and you work through that. But in DID, you create parts to survive and protect yourself. And so that integrated family systems model won't necessarily work exactly the way it is. So someone has to work with you, understanding that you may have different parts than what they would expect. There's also hypnosis that he used, and he used this not to access memories, but to help me distance from memories to contain the work between sessions and to help me when I was close to leaving therapy, to change my response from a freeze response to a fight response. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, he referred me to an art therapist, a massage therapist who did body work, because there's a lot of body memories involved in abuse that is blocked off and sectioned off. And then I also engaged in a mindfulness practice. And this was to help me to stay in my body. And then what I call emotions work. So doing the work of feeling. And I'll explain the ways in which this showed up in my work. Okay, so let's go through each one. So I'm going to tell you each one was critical and really helps me today. And it's true, they all are. Cognitive behavior therapy helps me a great deal to deal with anxiety, depression, to manage my world, and to live in the world. And the way that this showed up is in reframing and rewiring the way that I thought about things. And in particular, how I thought about myself and what happened to me. So when someone's abused growing up, they're told all kinds of stuff, like it's your fault, you're making me do these things, those kinds of things, and way more. And you believe them. And your brain is being wired to believe them. The more the abuse goes on, the more that you're told this stuff, the more that you think this is true. And why wouldn't you? This is a parent or a significant person in your life that's doing this. And so you think these things. Well, what happened with me is when I was remembering the things that happened to me, I was also remembering the things that I was told and believed. And I would say those things as well. So for example, my first memory of abuse was when I was 3 years old. And I was told that it was my fault, that I made my father do those things to me. When I would say those things, Rich would stop me and we would explore that. Well, really, does a 3-year-old know anything about sexual acts at all? Like, why would a 3-year-old want to do that? And when I thought about it in my brain, my present brain, not my brain that was, not the like thinking about it because somebody told me, but if I thought about it in my 1993 brain, I realized, yeah, I wouldn't even know how to do that if somebody didn't do that to me. And so then I'd kind of go through this analysis and I'd be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Well, so the next time a memory came up, the same thoughts would come up and I would say them again. And Rich would remind me of what we did before, how we talked about it. And I'd remember, oh yeah, right. And then it would come up again and I would say it again. And then I'd remember, oh yeah, we talked about that. That's not right. And then eventually I would stop thinking about that way and reframe with, yeah, that was something that was done to me and told to me to make me think it was my fault. And so that whole process, that cognitive behavior therapy process, was rewiring my brain and taking out all those toxic thoughts and helping me see the reality of what happened to me. And that worked because our brains are malleable. Neuroplasticity is this thing that allows us to rewire our brains. If you've ever changed a habit or started a new hobby or tried to lose weight, that's all done through neuroplasticity. It's changing behavior. It's changing the way you think and move through the world. So this has helped me a tremendous amount over the years because I don't have those toxic thoughts anymore. And I noticed that. And now in particular, when we have a pandemic going on, I noticed the ways in which my brain shifts to thinking about things in a more positive, looking for the good in the world kind of thing, rather than all the ways in which I was taught to think about myself in such negative ways. So it's a really powerful experience. Now, dialectical behavior therapy is a little bit different. So in the last session, I told you that, people with DID have lots and lots of noise going on in their head. Some people hear voices. For me, it was thoughts. There's a lot going on. And I learned when I was growing up to ignore the thoughts in my head because they would get in the way. And I couldn't study, I couldn't focus. So I ignored them most of the time. And then when I went into therapy, I had to pay attention to them again. I had to notice what they were. I had to understand what was going on. So that process of noticing them then became really hard because I felt like I had to act on all those thoughts. And so what I learned to do through the therapeutic process was to notice the thoughts that I was having and go behind them. And that I didn't have to act on them, but I could explore them and try to figure out why it was that I was feeling this way. So for example, if I was feeling really tense and angry, what's behind that? Anxiety is behind that. Sadness is behind that. Feeling like something's going to happen to me is behind that. So it's noticing the things, not acting on them, and then trying to figure out why that's coming up and what might be fueling those thoughts or feelings. It's a really powerful tool to use. I have to say, it's enabled me to be stable. And then over time, because I don't have very many parts, and because I've learned to pay attention to my parts and pay attention to how I feel, I'm able to move through the world without a lot of upset going on. So, but if something does happen, like in the course of time right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, an economic crisis, a racial justice crisis, and a political kind of craziness that, this would make anybody having a tough time, especially someone with DID. So I'm resting on my cognitive behavior therapy, my dialectical behavior therapy, and on that I'll show you to get through this. Okay, so part work. This is the trauma processing, and this is how I did it. I eventually had parts that would come forward, and I would notice them, and I would realize that's what it was. I learned this through my work with Rich, telling him what I was thinking, telling him what I was feeling. And so then I slowly started to meet the parts, and I learned about them. I learned what they do, what they did, and how they did it. And then I learned, at first I was horrified by it and really struggled with it. And I had to learn to appreciate the parts that I created to survive and have compassion for them, because there were parts that their response to danger was to initiate abuse. And that was really hard for me. So I had to have compassion for recognizing that that was a survival technique that I knew and that saved me many times. And so, so once I was able to accept the parts and have compassion and appreciation for them, that's when we started working together better. And then my healing really took off. So I learned how to work together with them, how I can take care of them, and how we can move together as one. And so what I've done now for about 20 some years, 25 years, I think, what I've done is I've learned to pay attention to my thoughts and pay attention to how I feel physically. And that's how I stay in touch with parts. And I make decisions based on that. Somebody asks me to do something, I think about it, pay attention to any thoughts that I'm having and feelings that I'm having, and then I make a decision, and then I might have to revisit that decision if things change inside. So it's how I learn to move through the world as seamless as possible. This part work is trauma processing. You're learning what happened, how it happened, what you did. And so if you think about the first segment that I did, I talked about having apparently normal parts of the personality and then emotional parts and then these fragments, right? I talked about having parts that looked like things that were in the room when I was being abused. Those were the pieces that led to the part, things that smelled, things that felt like this. Those were the things, the emotions that I had, the sensations that I experienced. Those were all parts that led me to the bigger pictures and to the AMPs and to the bigger parts. And all of that work came in here in what I call part work. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about how Rich used hypnosis. So when I would meet parts and they would share information with me about what happened, and the way they would do that is I would start getting pictures of what happened and I would tell Rich what I'd be seeing. And then it would start getting filled in with physical pain, and then eventually emotions. So it'd be pictures, pain, emotions, and then and sometimes it would be picture, 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 and then I'd have a bigger picture, and then I'd start feeling the pain, or sometimes it was at the same time. And then the emotions would come later after I would get the whole picture. So in that process, I would dissociate because it was hard to see what was happening and I needed distance from it. So Rich would stop me and have me notice how I was feeling. And then I would describe to him basically what the dissociation felt like. And then he would say, okay, that's dissociation. So I want you to pay attention to whenever you feel that way. Now, let's talk about this memory, and then he would use hypnosis to give me the distance that I needed from the memory that did not involve dissociation. So in that, I was able to tell him what happened with some distance, and that would enable me to stop dissociating. The other thing we did was we used hypnosis to help reintegrate memories and parts into me. So I might have the whole picture, but it feels like it's still out here. And Rich would help me through the use of hypnosis to connect and realize that that was me, that those things happened to. And then I would take that experience and have it feel like it happened to me. And then sometimes with that, parts went away because that was it. That was all they held. That was what their role was, to hold this away from me so I didn't find out. So I didn't have a role anymore. And then Rich would use hypnosis to help me contain the memories that I was experiencing between sessions so that I could still work and have my relationships and function in the world. And this became more and more limited as I became more and more flooded with memories. And then finally, Rich helped me to learn how to do self-hypnosis to help me through anxious times. And this again was so that I wouldn't dissociate, so that I would actively calm myself and ground myself to feel calm rather than letting my anxiety run away with me. That's particularly helpful right now. Okay, so then he referred me to an art therapist, and he did this during a time that I was getting flooded with memories. So what he did was the memories wouldn't contain between sessions. So he opened up his calendar and I saw him every day, Monday through Friday. And then on Saturdays, I would go see an art therapist. And then I would get through my Sundays and then see him again starting on Monday. So this helped me to manage the flooding that I was experiencing. It also helped me with younger parts because they didn't always have the vocabulary to talk about how they were feeling or what happened to them. And so drawing really helped bring that out. And then finally, it was really cool. I showed you last time one of the little talents that I had that I didn't remember that I had. So when I was 12 years old, the way that I coped with chaos in classrooms and with kind of checking out was through cartooning. And it first started off as doodles, and then it turned into little cartoons. So I still use that When I am struggling, I'll cartoon. Or sometimes when I'm just trying to pay attention, I'll cartoon. And so let me just stop the share for a second and show you. I think I showed this to you last time, but these are cartoons that I'm developing during the pandemic because it's helpful to me to draw. It's a mindfulness practice. It keeps me kind of grounded and calm and makes me feel pretty good. And I'm going to color these out. Anyway, these are just some of them. And just in case anybody's wondering, these are not my parts. So, because I don't have that many parts anymore. They're just people that I'm in meetings with and stuff. And, you know, just faces that I see every so often that I want to draw. So that's just this thing that I realized in art therapy that I could do. And it was super thrilling to figure that out. Okay, so that was the art therapy that he referred me to. So then Rich referred me to a massage therapist who worked with people who'd experienced trauma, and she would do body work with me. And what this did was it enabled me to get in touch with pain that was stored in the body that needed to be released. And it would help me to identify whether pain was pain that was happening now because of an injury or an illness that's going on, or if it was old pain that I'm feeling now because I'm doing the work of healing. So that was an important thing to be able to start to distinguish so that I'd learn how to take care of myself. It also, working with a massage therapist also enabled me to reintegrate that physical pain, that physical injury into my experience as something that happened to me a long time ago, and not as something that was happening to me now. And then also I learned that massage therapy is really good for you. It helps for relaxation. It helps for healing of physical injuries. I was very athletic. And so it really kind of helped me take care of myself better. So then there was mindfulness practice. So here's the thing with mindfulness practice. I started doing this when we started focusing on how much I was dissociating. So again, remember when I'm telling Rich about a memory, I start to dissociate and he tells me, he stops me and he asks me to tell him how I feel. And I'm marking that. So I would feel dazed, I'd feel slow, felt like I had a really, really bad head cold, like I had cotton between my ears, I had a really hard time focusing, and my speech and processing would slow down. So I learned that that was dissociation, and it meant that something had happened that made me feel like that's what I needed to do to protect myself. So in the mindfulness practice that I did, I slowed things down and tried to stay in my body as much as possible. I did this by not multitasking, by paying attention to what I was doing when I was doing it, which was a new experience for me. And yoga was also something that I used to help with that, to help me feel the strength in my body and to feel connected between my mind and my body while I was doing yoga. So it was this mindfulness really kind of helped me stay calm, grounded, and in my body. And then I learned that that's really good for people and that I should do stuff like this that help me do that on a regular basis. So again, where the cartooning comes in, I like coloring, you know, and also I try really hard to pay attention to what I'm doing when I'm doing it. Means I'm slower at stuff, but it also means that I'm not dissociating. And then I learned about dissociation and how it felt not to dissociate. So then it was easier to tell when I was, and then I would start to identify what was it that happened that made me feel this way, that made me go to dissociation. And then I would try to change those conditions so that I didn't have to dissociate. So anyway, so that was a lot of the work that I was doing with mindfulness. And now I do all those things very naturally because it's been so many years of doing that. Okay, now the emotions work, Rich would incorporate into who I was as a person ways to release the emotions that were stored up inside me that I never experienced when I was abused because it wasn't safe to. And this was grief, profound amounts of sorrow, fear, panic, and enormous amounts of rage. And the rage was probably the hardest. So he would incorporate it into my exercise routines. And I would say things in my head. And then sometimes, if I was by myself, I would say them out loud. So, for example, I did some kickboxing. And then when I was doing that, I would pretend that I was beating up someone who had hurt me. And I would say the things that I never got a chance to tell them. So those are the ways in which he used movement. He used it in when I ran, when I jump rope, anything that I was doing, he incorporated that emotions work inside of it to help release that. And then he referred me to an acupuncturist, and a lot of the grief that I felt by not really having a family that took care of me, but having a family that abused me. That really helped with acupuncture to release a lot of that. So this is a pretty extensive healing process. Like everything he recommended, I did. And so what can you do? Like, why do I want you to know this? Well, first of all, it's important when you're working with survivors who have DID to know what the healing process is like so that you can kind of have a sense of, is the person that the survivor is working with, is that person qualified to do this work? Are they doing a good job? Are they creating more chaos for this person? Or are they helping this person achieve safety and stability? So the more that you learn about DID, what's the truth about DID and what's been a fiction made up to undermine DID, the better it'll be for the people that you work with. And then to understand some of the impact on people that DID has on the people who have it and their families and supports is really important, so that you can help someone think through what's going on for them and how you can support them. And then learning the healing process. All those things are really important. Then for you to share that information with the people that you work with, not just within your advocacy organization, but let's say you're working with someone who had a recent sexual assault, who didn't know they had DID, but all of a sudden stuff started happening to them, and the prosecutors involved, law enforcement's involved, and none of them know about DID, but you start seeing signs of DID. Well, if those folks know about DID, then they might see signs of it as well, and you all can strategize about how best to help that survivor. But if you're the only person that knows about DID, then when this is happening and you're trying to explain, because that survivor wants you to explain to them what's going on, they may not believe you. They may not believe that this is DID, or they may be much more skeptical. If you do it ahead of time, if people understand that DID is real and people will show up in your community this way, then when they are working with someone, they're going to have a knowledge base to work with. And it won't be what's wrong with that person. It's going to be what happened to that person, because DID is evidence of something happening to someone. And then the last thing is, when you're working with someone with DID, helping them to have safety and stability and helping to manage crises is huge. Because when you can do that with someone, it helps them to be proactive. And that kind of puts them back in charge of their life, whether they have an extensive healing process or not. The main thing is to have a level of safety and stability that they can move through their life and do as well as they can. People who want to go through an extensive healing process, finding out who's in your community, in your area, and helping to make connections for them would also be really helpful. And so finding out more about DID, you can reach out to me. I have a booklet that was written for clinicians. This is the cover of it. It's really, really helpful for, I think, anybody to read. Then there's also all kinds of research that's been done in the States around DID that I'm happy to send people if that's what you want. And I have websites like An Infinite Mind, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and then my website, as well as others where you can get more information. So feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with that. If you're a clinician and you're working with clients, and consider that DID is a possibility. And so what you're looking for is someone who's coming to see you who has these big gaps in their past, and that to explore that it's possible, or someone who says they're hearing voices. It's possible that it might be DID. I'm not trying to get you to diagnose people with DID, but if someone does have DID and they do go through a healing process that's consistent with that 3-phase approach, they're going to get better. They're going to have more control over their lives. They're going to be safer. So I want people to think about that instead of schizophrenia or bipolar or borderline personality, because these are all also misdiagnoses for people with DID. And the longer they're misdiagnosed and given medication that doesn't really help them, the more time that they don't have to work on safety and stability and being proactive in their lives. So consider DID. If you're an advocate and to look in your community to who has expertise to work with someone with DID. And then you'll have a sense of whether their approach is consistent with the healing process that I just described. And if you're a clinician and you want to work with people with DID, you can get training from the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. And you can also seek out supervision by some of the clinicians that are involved in that group. Okay, so I think that's everything. I don't know if I did this in 30 minutes. I'm really trying to, because I know people spend so much time on Zoom that it's hard to spend even more time on Zoom. So remember, we're going to have a live Q&A session coming up. So if there are things here that didn't make sense or that you have questions about, please, I encourage you to come and for us to have a conversation about it. In the meantime, thank you so much for caring about this issue and for working with the people that you work with. It's just really important. Thanks.